Anyway, so today's session, as you can say, Thursday, 2nd of April this year, is about company culture and consulting. It's basically really around the importance of understanding a company's culture if you want to make any change to it, implement any new technology, or just generally work with them. So it's the importance of a company culture. So a little bit of background about me. I've done it. I think it's about the 6th or 7th iExperts presentation I've done, covering a number of topics. But yeah, basically I work in a number of areas, primarily financial services, technology, primarily UK, Europe, and the US. And in the Middle East as well. I've worked on a number of projects there, which I've listed, and I've a published author, speaker, and I work for the Open University in technology management. So, okay, enough about me. So just piling in. So there's probably 7 main areas I want to cover here. One is, why is culture so important? The second thing is to understand exactly what culture is, how moving on to how the cultures grow and develop, and how these cultures then shape an organization. How do you actually define and measure a culture? If you can't measure something, it's very hard to work within it. Section 6 there is basically how to change an organization's culture. Again, not added that in because it's always a key thing. And another one is around a case study. I've got a couple of case studies there to try and make it come alive. And the last section is a bit of a wrap up, which is hopefully at the very, very end. Right, I managed to mute myself in some reason. So the first key thing there is basically why is culture so important for consultants? Anyway, so let's move on. So I think the key thing, there's lots of writing about this, but all organizations have their own culture. They may have different cultures across different locations, whether that's in the same country or across borders. They may have different industries have different cultures, and particularly from the UK, you tend to find the public, which is like the civil service owned by the government, tends to be very, very controlled and considered, where private organisations, commercial organisations, tend to be a little bit more aggressive. Not saying one's better than the other; it's more of a fact. And what you tend to find is that organisations will have subcultures within them. You may have, I've worked with a lot of American banks who've got offices dotted all around the globe. The American culture in the US is very different, say, from Peru or Argentina, the UK, Europe, India, China, Australia. So that's a key thing to measure. Remember, basically what a culture does, it defines how an organisation operates and how things are done or not done there. So it's effectively means for a consultant who wants to work in an organisation, it's very important to understand how the culture operates, so you can actually sort of like fit into it and work with it going forward. So therefore, you need to be able to understand an organisation's culture quickly, and to ensure you need to work within that culture to increase the probability of delivering assessments successfully. I.e., it's much better to work within the culture for success than trying to work against it on that. And as I said there, and it is challenging to work against a culture, and it's even more challenging to change a culture, although I do have some slides on that later on. So exactly what is a culture? Because it's often a very, very misused phrase that lots and lots of people use, but no one really defines. So it's actually hard to define in a clear, tangible way for those who are very left-brained and technology people like myself. Trying to understand something that's very intangible is actually quite stressful. People often try and label cultures into a box, like a tough guy, a passive culture, a fast culture, a friendly culture. But this is very misleading because basically most cultures are very, very complex. As you said there, it's a combination of shared beliefs and values. And it just basically defines how an organization does things. So just to try and say it's a tough guy or passive is very, very misleading and oversimplifies something that's very, very complex. So this culture then is reinforced by the actions and behaviours within the organisation. So again, what the culture does, these combinations of beliefs and values, etc., will actually determine how things are done or not done with an organisation. It's effectively the personality of the organisation. In the same way, some people have got very laid back personalities. Some people have got very aggressive personalities. Some people are very, very hyper personalities. So basically, if you can imagine that for an organisation. And some of the, like some other cultures can be very helpful, dynamic, plus many others. So, we've looked at number one, which is why a culture is so important for all for consultants anyway. Basically it's the way things are done. So we've also looked at what it is, which is effectively, I use a horrible phrase, it's a personality, and it's full of actually many, many different variables. But now almost thinking, how do cultures actually grow and develop? How does this organization you're working with got a very, very customer focused culture or a very, very cost conscious culture? So so basically, culture itself is shaped and driven by many interlinking factors. Management, people at the top's behaviours will dictate and drive and dictate how things are done. So if you've got a very, very aggressive management team, you're likely the culture's going to have an element of aggression in it. Behaviours, staff, if they're hardworking, are they 9 to 5ers? Are they very laid back? Those sort of things again actually dictate and feed into the culture. Experiences, if an organisation's had some very bad experiences, that could dictate culture. For example, if you've got a firm that's gone through maybe some very, very, very poor times, bankruptcy or near bankruptcy, they're going to be very, very, very maybe risk averse. Where if you've got an organisation that's very, very, very successful, they may be much more aggressive. Again, we can go through it a bit later. The actual market and industry. Certain industries like tech tend to be very, very fast moving. So cultures there tend to be very much, let's get to market quick, let's break things. I think that's what the chat from Google says. Where if you look at things like medicine and medical and hospitals, a mistake in a hospital could cost somebody their life. So they tend to be a little bit more slow and considered, a bit more risk adverse. Management will be there very much along the lines of saying, are we 100% sure on this going forward? Different structures and the history. So on the structures, if you've got a very bureaucratic, big, large organization, things are naturally going to be slow. History, as I mentioned before, organizations have had a poor history or a good history, that's going to make the culture that way. In the same way, if you look at an individual, if you've always struggled to have money, you may be very, very frugal. You don't want to spend money. But if you've always had lots and lots of money and rich parents or always had a good job, you're going to spend money. Myths and legends. And this is actually an interesting one, actually, because particularly large organizations, they're going to have mythical legends about events that happened 10 years ago, or you're going to have myths about very, very famous people, and that could develop into the culture. And a good example would be something like many, many years ago, a chap called Richard Branson used to run the Virgin Group in the UK. Obviously, it was global, but primarily UK. There's lots of myths about his fantastic customer service. He's giving to charity, him just being a generally nice guy, obviously. And that myth and legend sort of like fed it into the culture. So Virgin always focused on being nice, having good culture, so having good customer service, and so on. Another key point to mention there is organizations will have different subcultures. So this could be across locations, functions, and time zones. I mean, even in the UK, which compared to some countries is actually absolutely tiny, you'd have different ways of working in different parts of the country. So you could have, for example, I work primarily in London. Most people in London go home at night, go back to their family, but they don't tend to socialise because they all go to different parts of the southeast of England. But if you move to a different part of the UK, you could have people who actually socialise after work. So the culture there is much more of a social friendliness between your staff and everything, as opposed to actually where you're a bit more dispersed. And this is also particularly true for organisations that have many mergers and acquisitions. And this is actually one of the case studies later on, is that I worked at a very large bank, many, probably get on to about 20 odd years ago now. And they bought a subsidiary. They were an American bank who bought a subsidiary in Europe. The European bank was very small, very nimble, very, very quick, probably a little bit risky for their own good, where the American bank that bought them was very big, slow, very, very, very conservative, and very analytical. So you had this subculture from was of a very small, agile organization, quite almost like not risk averse, owned by a large organization that was very risk averse. And that caused quite a lot of tension, but that's one of the case studies I can look at later on. Okay, so I mean, going for it again. So we've sort of described why is culture so important, i.e., it's the personality, and if you want to get stuff done, you need to work within the culture. We've described what culture exactly is, which is effectively the personality organisation, and we discussed basically how do cultures grow and develop, which is along the lines of history, the people in there, the behaviours, myths and legends. It's a bit like a human personality; it evolves over time. So looking at the other areas would be, how does a culture shape an organisation? First of all, it drives performance. A culture, because it dictates behaviours and what have you, it would determine how things are done, which then did drive performance. And that could be in operations, customers. How do you treat your customers? I've never actually ever met an organisation that actually says publicly they treat their customers with disdain, but when you get inside an organisation, some of them do. See the customers almost somebody they can take money off of, I suppose, to give a good service. So then that's all like that performance there will do that. How do you treat suppliers? Do you treat suppliers as a genuine, like a joint venture or a proper relationship, or do you treat them as somebody to be used and abused, and pay them when they feel like it? How do they cope with risk? As I mentioned earlier, you might get some like an individual. You might get a personality of a person who's very risky. He's quite willing to go skiing and jump off of cliffs and stuff like that. And we'll get somebody like myself who's walking up the stairs is actually quite a worrying thing. So that's the key point now. And others. So basically, there is this horrible phrase that's been going around: culture eats strategy, which gets bandied around quite a lot, and a lot of people don't really understand what it means. I think even the bloke who wrote it doesn't. Well, basically, what it's trying to say is, you could have a very good, for example, you could have a good strategy that's focused on giving good customer service, developing good products, but unless you've got the personality or the organizational culture or the organizational personality that's focused on customer service, that strategy won't work. Which is why many firms fail. They'll often focus on the strategy, getting those all ideas, but don't change in the behaviours to do it. So basically what it's saying is if you want to have a good strategy, then it must match the culture, and therefore the culture must match the strategy. Hence, culture eats strategy. A lot of organisations are looking to change their culture, as I mentioned earlier on, to try and make it a better fit to their strategy. It's not an easy task. I mean, I've worked a number of projects over the years where you're trying to change culture, and it's actually hard work. It's actually almost impossible to a certain extent. You really do have to be quite brutal on it. But there's a few slides on that later. It's gradual. I mean, don't expect you can start the project on a Monday and have it done by the following week. It could take many months, if not years, or even 5 or 6 years. I've seen it done. And it's a gradual change. Again, if you compare strategy to personality, trying to change a person's personality takes time. It's not something you can just do by the click of the fingers or writing a check out. As I said before, it's like changing a person's personality. Okay, so the first 4 points there we've gone through already. So, why is it important? Because you need to understand the culture of where you're working to make things happen. It's a lot better to fit into the culture as opposed to changing it. We define what the culture is, which is effectively the personality of the organisation. Very, very complex, multi-faceted, multivariate factor. We've understood how cultures grow and develop, i.e. they grow as through history, through behaviours, through successes, through failures, etc. And we said basically how the organisation shapes an organisation. So what we're trying to say there is basically, the strategy and the culture of organisation need to match. If you have a bit mismatch, culture will always win. So we'll probably just section 5 is probably, and maybe section 6 is probably the bulk of the presentation. So it will take, I will go through them bit by bit, but so please bear with me. So basically the key thing here is, basically if you want to sort of like work within a culture, you need to sort of like understand it or measure it as much as one can and help define it. Because if you can't measure it or you don't understand it, how can you work within it? So basically, as I mentioned earlier, some people try and define culture by placing them into pigeonholes or boxes, an aggressive culture, a self-learning culture, customer focused, risk adverse, passive, a machine, bureaucracy type thing, and other things like that. And people often think of good cultures versus bad cultures, which is very overgeneralization, something that's far too complicated. And as I said there, it doesn't really represent the complex nature of culture, which you can imagine is a very, very complicated multivariate factor, especially cultures. So basically, the way I've always tried to define culture is really look at it for a range of different variables, like a multivariate measure, which is a great academic term for meaning it's multiple variables you can measure something. And initially, I look at at a very high level, look at two very simple measures to help define and measure culture. The first one, I look at internal and external factors. Obviously, organizations have their internal stuff and have their external stuff, customers and suppliers and marketers. And there's stuff that I say is tangible, which are things that are easy to measure and easy to understand. And there's at the bottom down there items that are actually a bit intangible, a bit softer to understand, but I'll come to that in a sec. So if you look at the stuff that was internal and also soft, it'll be things like trust, power, teamwork, decision making, etc. All that sort of like the way that sort of internal stuff works. If you look at the tangible factors that are internal, is effectively, what is the strategic direction of the organization? How siloed is it? Is it split into little pieces and they never speak? How does the operating model work? All process controls, and what's their attitude to money, i.e., will they spend it or not? Moving across, the external hard tangible factors are things like, how do you deal with your clients? What are your clients like? Suppliers? What's the regulatory environment? In certain areas like financial services, aerospace, and medical, the regulatory environment is brutal and very, 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 very tough. The other areas around things like competition and market industry. And the other internal thing is actually the same items, but more how do you deal with them? Do you treat your suppliers as somebody you despise? Do you split your customers as someone you despise and you just want to take money out of? Or you generally like them and want to build with them? Obviously, quite a lot of here. So I'm just going to drill down into this a little bit more detail. So most of the impact really around is on the internal versus intangible factors. So we're looking at them first. So the first one is trust and integrity. Effectively, do people trust each other? Or is there a case of, I say, watch six, which I'm told is something to do with cover their backsides and more worried about protecting themselves than trying to do a good job. A lack of trust is a good indicator of politics, game plan, and a lack of general togetherness. So if you do find the organisation you're working with has very little trust or integrity, those two, that could be a challenge you need to work through. And on there's various actions around, make sure pick the right people involved, be open and honest, listen to people, admit your mistakes, be helpful. And you need to be whiter than white yourself, which is an English phrase to mean is make sure you don't make any mistakes. The next one is around power bases. And all organizations have power bases. And they could also have suppliers who are very dominant. You've outsourced to a technology firm and they effectively dictate everything. And also you get indirect power spaces that come from knowledge or politics, or Freddie in the corner who's the expert on this. So really, if you've got a lot of problems with power bases, you need to determine the power bases and basically work with them and try and integrate yourself with them. And same with the indirect power bases, understand how they work and build good relationships with them. Other areas is around teamwork. Everybody says they've got teamwork and they all work together, one for all and all for one, whatever the phrase is. But do they really work together? But do they just appear to be working together? A lack of team togetherness is a good indicator of politics, poor trust and self-protection. And if you notice those areas, this is where you probably need to be alert. Again, it's very similar to the previous ones, include the right people, be consistent, trust people to do their job, but monitor them tactfully, just keep an eye on them and be very thankful regarding what you've done. It doesn't harm to say thank you, and it'd be amazing the amount of people who don't say thank you, and take the lead. But again, teamwork is, if teams don't work together, you need to do something there to try and move into that culture. Management, as in senior management, are they very supportive to staff and consultants? Are they almost a case of sooner anything goes wrong, they blame the staff member very publicly, or if there's a problem goes on, the manager jumps in, he or she, to support the problem. What's their technical knowledge like? If you're working in technology, do they understand technology? Yeah, not unexpected they're going to understand everything, but you'd expect them to have some technical knowledge. And what's their soft skills? How do they deal with people? How do they deal with conflict? How do they deal with disagreements? How do they deal with awkward situations? So the key thing is, like I said before, is to work out the relationship with your seniors. Ask management to support you, and understand technical skills. If they've got technical skills, bring people in to help. If they do have poor people skills, or soft skills, as I put it, you need to be thick-skinned. I mean, I worked with a manager who was actually quite abusive many years ago, and I'm not surprised that I didn't actually thump him, to be honest with you. But sometimes you just need to be thick-skilled and try and build a relationship. You have to be the grown-up person here. And other areas there, autonomy and decision making. How are decisions made? Can people make decisions at a junior level or a medium level, or does everything have to be referred upstairs? A lack of freedom to make decisions can actually, as a cause of a sort of like poorly working organisation, and that can conduce congestions and problems if you need things to get done. So it's often the case of understanding what decisions need to be made, and if it's and just work through those processes. Human management, sort of touched on this earlier, but how do they interact with each other? Are the people you're working with, are they quite friendly? Are they sociable? Do they speak to each other? Or do they just try to be friendly with each other? Or or the other extreme is a really open nastiness, or even worse, toxicity in your organisation. Again, if you're coming in to work with a culture along those lines, you need to understand those. Again, you need to be very professional. You need to be polite. You need to be thick-skinned, because you will get things that are going to be said to you that upset you, and so on. And also the point down there is the following one there. If you're very nervous about lack of interaction or support, make sure everything's documented in email. It will cover your backside, to put it bluntly, and also will cover make sure everything's very clear. Other areas here, just mopping up here, almost done this section. Communication. How clear is communication coming down? Is it very specific? Are management very clear on what needs to be done or what needs not to be done? Is the communication very vague? How is bad news reported? The best organisation is going to have a thing. Or would they actually spin bad news to make it sound good, or blame somebody? Again, you need to sort of like learn to read between the lines. And how frequent is communication, when it's done? If communication isn't free-flowing, then you do have an issue with the culture there you need to work through. So you may have to think about implementing your own communication, what have you. Ask them how they want to receive bad news. Some organisations say, tell me verbally. Others send an email out. Others tell me on a Friday. Bad news Friday I've seen before. But also the other key thing is, if you're worried about an organisation that's got very poor communication that's causing problems, try and keep to the facts, and remove, we are going to be 2 days late on this. That's a fact. Don't say along the lines of, this is really, really bad. We're going to be at least 2 days late. It's all over the place. It's a load of old rubbish. Just try and keep it very pure and simple and keep to the facts. And the other item down here is risk appetite. If you've got an organisation that's got a very low risk appetite, they can be very slow and sometimes hard to work with. That's maybe the nature of the beast. Medical firms, construction firms tend to be low risk. That's not a problem. You just need to work with it. Conversely, if they're a very high risk organisation, they could be this freewheeling. You think, no, this 1 minute, we're going to go over here, and the next minute we're going to go over here. Don't worry about anything else. We're going to do what we're going to do. So it's more of a case of they really understand the risks, or are they just completely oblivious to it. So I think the level of risk is a good indicator of the speed of organisation. But again, there's nothing wrong with having a low risk organisation or a high risk organisation. It's dictated by probably external factors. So therefore you just need to understand it. Fear and resistance. Again, another item here is very much along the lines of, are people scared to raise bad news? Or will they leave you as a project manager or a consultant or a project person to raise the issues that they're too scared to raise? I remember I worked at an organisation once where the manager, it was a lady actually. I remember she was actually quite a dominating character and actually quite scary, to be honest with you. And lots of people didn't really want to raise any issues to her, but me as a project manager had to do those. So it was, yeah, you just felt people just jumping out of the way and not doing their responsibility. Also, fear is a good indication of a lack of support. So people are very nervous about raising issues. It probably thinks their manager's not going to support them or the organisation's not going to support them. So therefore, just again, that's something you need to work through as a notes down there. And last but not least is inclusion and diversity. This is in the UK at the moment. This is obviously a very, very critical area where they're trying to ensure that all groups are represented in organisations because basically it makes them perform better. To be honest with you, but a lot of firms will say they are diverse and they're inclusive, but when you look at it, you just think no, they're not. So really, a case are they generally happy to have different genders, races, and what across the organisation? Are people invited from different backgrounds, different educations, or does it seem they're all come from the same school or the same place before? If that's a problem, then obviously that's that you need to work through. So therefore, what you really need to do is ensure that when you're doing your work, you involve all the relevant people on that. Okay, so that's quite a lot to take in. Do apologise. I mentioned that's quite a heavy section actually. So basically, as you can see there in the blue cross in the bottom left-hand corner, I've sort of covered the internal and the intangible factors, which are the main issues that define culture. And if you need to understand how these variables work, so you can sort of like understand your culture and you can do some work on it. So just looking at the internal factors, which are actually a bit more tangible, a bit more easy to see and measure. Strategic direction. This is a key thing. Every firm should have a strategic direction. We're going to be the best software vendor within 5 years. We're going to have the most customers in the 5 years, or we're going to be the cheapest firm in the next 5 years. So basically, how well is this strategic direction understood, and do people believe it? A lot of firms will have these great visions. We're going to change the world, but people often don't believe it. They just see it as a joke and just go along with it and get on with their tiny little thing. So this obviously can create some issues when you're trying to understand the culture and run with it. Bigger firms, this is often quite common because you may end up with a very large firm, running multiple product lines. And it's very hard if you're one product line to see the bigger picture, which basically means firms then focus on what they're doing and not really looking at the bigger picture, which is often a problem. But the key thing is if firms don't understand what they're doing, then basically the culture can be very muddled, and therefore it causes you problems if you're trying to work within it. The other thing is how siloed is the organisation? This is basically, is it split into obviously every organisation has different silos, different departments and different teams doing it. But does this siloed nature cause issues? For example, politics. One part of the organisation will only look after themselves, and they don't really care their impact on somebody else. And also the other thing is the silos cause to poorly completed acquisitions. As I mentioned earlier, there was a case study where a firm I worked with, a large risk adverse, let's say, firm bought over a smaller firm, a bank that was, let's say, far more risk happy. And that caused a lot of problems, and it became very, very siloed because they almost put up defensive walls around it. Unlikely to fix a poor silo as part of your work, unless you've been brought in to do that. But basically, it's important if you've got people across and silos are quite split and segregated and there's political and cultural wars between them, you need to involve all people from the silos. It could result in a large number of people, but that's the nature of the beast. Operating model. This is like the internal processes, people, systems that are actually done within the organisation to run through everything on a day-to-day basis. So basically, is it understood? One of the biggest challenges I find as a contractor consultant going in is you ask people about, how does this work? How does that work? And no one seems to know. They know their little bit, but not everything big. And bearing in mind, a lot of these operating models will be, multiple bits of technology, suppliers, many suppliers. could be across many locations, many time zones, many geographical spreads. So you can imagine all these tiny bits will have their own little bit of culture, all working slightly different. And also the key thing there, you just need to understand really each bit of those cultures, because obviously, yeah, if you're doing a major change, you could impact most of the operating model. If, say, for example, you're rolling out a new website, it could impact the technology element, it could impact your suppliers. It could obviously, you might have support teams over different time zones and locations, so you need to involve all of them. So basically, the key thing is if the operating model is poorly understood, you need to involve lots of people from these different bits of siloed culture in the process. The next one's around sort of process and controls. Effectively, how much controls are there around the business? For example, I work in financial services, and there tend to be quite hard, severe controls around it, especially if you're moving lots of money around. And that's very much around the controls are there to stop things going wrong on that. But sometimes people have controls in there that they just become constrained to stop things happening. They're a political tool, to say, my department's more important than yours, so I won't allow anything to happen until you've done my bit of my work. And sometimes there's a phrase in the UK, a sledgehammer for a nut. So basically using a sledgehammer to crack a nut, which is a polite way of saying is the control too heavy. Again, if the processes and controls are very heavy, as I mentioned there, they can be very bureaucratic, political and self-preserving. But you need to find a way of working within these. You need to understand the processes. You need to understand what needs to be done, or any ways that can be shortcut or anything like that. And the last one on this section, anyway, I think, is money. So the key thing there is the firm willing to spend money? Obviously, firms do need to spend money. You might some firms who are very cash rich, who are quite willing to spend on the money, especially if you're doing a project. But other firms, obviously, maybe are not so profitable, will be a little bit less willing to spend money. But the key thing there is you need to understand how they need to spend money. What is the process for requesting the money? You tend to find firms that are very risk adverse will have very, very strict controls around about allocating and spending money. Again, if you're coming in to do some work, you're unlikely to change that, so you just need to work on that. This moving, I've done the last one is one big orange, as you can see, because they're very much linked on that. The first item, sorry, beg pardon, got carried away. So this is actually looking at all the external factors. So obviously, as you can see, the two blue crosses on the left is very, very much focused on the, excuse me, is very, very much focused on the internal factors, strategic direction, trust, power bases, which is within the organisations. But obviously, depending where you're working in the world, external factors such as suppliers and regulatory environment will impact the culture as well. So suppliers, basically, what's your suppliers like? How well are they managed? Do you manage them well? Who has the most control? Sometimes if you outsource or use a major supplier, that got more control over you than you got control over them. So again, that's a key dynamic to understand if you want to work within the culture. Are the suppliers, what's the suppliers' cultures like? Are you a small firm working with a large supplier? If that means is you can only go as fast or as slow as a supplier allows. And how many suppliers do you have? I mean, certain firms, big firms, you could have 6 or 7 suppliers working together on a product, at least, which basically means you have lots and lots of problems and you need to work together on those, and they could end up arguing, and they may have cultural differences as well. So this is actually quite a key area. So, but the key thing is to try and understand the suppliers, how they work on a like a process way, how they work on a sort of like a cultural way, and trying to make sure you can bring all these together. And it's exactly the same as well. It's for customers. For example, what is the makeup of your customers? Have you got 1 or 2 large customers who give you all your business, and because they're so powerful, they tend to dictate to you what you do? Or do you have lots and lots of smaller customers like retail clients on that? Also, the other thing is you understand how well customers are managed, who has the most control. If you feel that very much while there's no harm in giving good customer service, obviously you do need to ensure that you've got to run a business. So the thing is, if you have issues that your customers or your suppliers dictate things to you, you'll have an issue, a cultural challenge there around the fact that you're going to be very risk adverse and you're very nervous about making decisions, and because you may impact your customers. The other areas around there is the regulatory environment. Again, I work in financial services. It's very, very regulatory heavy on that. So effectively, you can. I'm working at the moment setting up a new trading firm. We're looking to go through the process on that. We're going to the regulator, and they're coming back with literally 50, 60 questions on what and they're all good questions. There's nothing nasty there. So effectively, you need to understand what's the regulatory environment, because if you've got a very heavy, strong, heavy, dominant regulatory environment as I say, financial services and other areas, there will be a drag on what you can do, and you need to factor that in. That firms will be who work in these environments will be very risk adverse, very nervous about making decisions. They will probably want to double, treble, quadruple check any decisions they make. So it does cause impacts to behaviours. And competition. The other area there is how competitive is your firm. If you're one of the market leaders, you tend to have a bit more freedom. Obviously you have to be careful to make sure you don't become a market follower. But if you're a market leader, firms will be a bit more dictative. They would quite willing to take probably a little bit more risk, maybe a little bit more aggressive. So they're very much a culture of get up and go type thing. But if the firms, maybe struggling in the industry, or even actually the worst firm in the industry, the challenge they're going to have is that they will struggle to make any decisions. They'll be slow. They'll be nervous. So so basically, again, to understand that culture, you need to work into that on that. So again, it's understanding how do you fit in with a wider environment. And the final one there is actually, or the penultimate one, I think, is the market and industry. What is the dynamics of the marketplace? Is it fast technology? It tends to be very fast-paced change. Something comes out within a month, something else comes out, and it's better. So basically, you need to be along those lines. But if you're working in medicine, it's it's obviously very dynamic. There's lots and lots of texts you have to go through to get a new medicine out into the world. So therefore, if you're working in a culture in an industry that's very, very fast changing and stable, so very fast changing and rapid, you will be working. The culture will often have to match that. Where if you're working in an industry, it's slow and stable, takes a long time to get things approved, etc. Which is not a problem. It is what it is. It can make decisions slower, and it can seem quite painful. Okay, so therefore, that's probably the bulk of the presentation. Sort of covered all of these. I appreciate there's quite a lot to take in, but the point I'm trying to make is there is various factors that you can have to worry about on that. For example, on the internal side, direction, behaviours is all very, very key. But also understand, looking at the right-hand side, unfortunately those crosses are in the way. Things like suppliers, competition, and the regulatory environment dictate how the organisation can operate and it impacts its culture. So basically, the next two items is just to talk through how do we change it. So obviously we've defined the culture, and it's, as you hopefully have understood, it's incredibly complicated. As I said before, multiple firms will have cultures. Firms will have multiple cultures in it. So how can you change it? It's not easy, but it is possible. But it does take a time. And I've just done I hope you can see that. This slide never looks that quite good when it's been presented. But the first one is, as I mentioned earlier, if you want to define, you need to define the culture that you want. And how it can be measured. So, how can it be changed? So for example, you might want a culture that's very, very, very customer focused and what have you. So therefore, you need to say what cultural changes do we need for staff, customers, suppliers, general public. So you need to set a plan with milestones. You need to define what behaviours are needed and what is not negotiable. So therefore, you need to say, we expect everybody to have good customer service. Therefore, we expect everybody to answer telephone calls. We expect to treat customers with respect, type thing. And and if you don't do this, there could be implications. You to ensure the strategy and the culture match. As I mentioned earlier, you can have the greatest strategy in the world. You can employ the greatest consultants in the world to get it done. But if the culture doesn't match it, you're never going to get it done. So therefore, you need to ensure that the culture and strategy match. And if you don't make any differences, for challenges, you need to take action. Best thing is also to make people accountable. Senior management, if you're changing, say, for example, you move into a culture that supports good customer service and growth, They must be accountable, and it means you've got a visible from senior management, and they need to provide real support. But all staff need to be involved. Therefore, you need champions, people on the ground who's doing the work, who are quite willing to step up and be visible. You can reward people for good behaviours. I say pay rises, appraisals. Sometimes just getting their name saying thank you can actually match work as well. If you've got constant bad behaviour, remove people. If you're trying to do something where you're trying to reduce costs down, have a low cost culture, and people are spending money, then why are you still employing them? And that means you obviously need to recruit staff if required. The next area is, as it's sort of very similar to the strategy one earlier, you need the inner workings of the organisation, processes, people, systems, suppliers, and communication need to match the culture. So if you're going to have a customer a culture that, so for example, is cost cutting, you need to ensure all of the processes match that. Make changes visible, or make visible changes, i.e. Low hanging fruit, as we call it. So if you can make changes that will enforce the changes, these need to be set by senior management and all levels of staff. I don't just sit there and hide behind a PowerPoint deck. Actually make the changes. Make sure the culture matches the brand. So, for example, if you look at a lot of these big firms that have very, very sort of like, I'll say, something like a BMW, where it's not the cheapest car you're ever going to get, but it's going to be very high quality. So the brand is not cheap but high quality. So therefore, you need to make sure that that's the brand you've got matches your culture. Otherwise, it's a bit like if it doesn't match the strategy, it'll be all over the place. Measure success. Oops, sorry, got a little message pop up here. Measure success. So that would be things like do staff surveys, interviews. Make sure the culture you're aiming for. How far away from it are you? And if you're far away, make some more changes. It's a classic case of do, measure, react. Do, measure, react. Unfortunately, it will cost. I've got pound signs down there, but that could be euros, dollars, or any other thing. So you may need training, you will need process changes, monitoring. So therefore, be prepared to spend. And this is probably maybe this and the next one are probably the two. Culture, like a personality, doesn't change overnight. It can take years to complete. So therefore, you've got to be persistent. If after 6 to 9 months you're still struggling to change it materially, don't give up. 6 to 9 months is a short term. There will be problems again. You probably picked up there, whether that is things like resistance, fear, misunderstanding, nervousness. Like any change, people are always scared of the new. So therefore, staff will need to be supported. They may ask silly questions, or you think they're silly questions, but they will be supported. So therefore, you need a clear communication. Staff, whether it's to staff, to suppliers, to customers, to everyone who's impacted by it, they need communication. But the key thing is to understand that there will be problems and prepare yourself for problems. The next one, oops, gone the wrong way. The next one is be brave. Sounds a bit weird. Sounds like a sports thing. If it is done properly, change is good. As I said before, it will take time and cost money and will be hard work, but it needs persistence and determination. I've worked at organisations that have flipped themselves from slow, bureaucratic to a very customer-faced culture, and it's been good. And, it's very much, if you can get it done right, the journey is worth the end state is worth the journey. Okay, conscious now, I don't want to overrun, to be honest with you. So we've gone through probably the 6 main points. So we've gone through why is culture so important, i.e., you need to understand the culture of organisation so you can actually fit within it to work. We've understood what the culture is. Very, very simply, it's so oversimply, it's the personality of organisation. We've understood, how cultures can grow and develop, over time, experiences, management, behaviours, myths and lineaging. And we've looked at under 4, how does a culture shape or drive an organisation? It determines how things are done effectively, or how things are not done, as the case may be. Then we went through quite a few slides and points regarding what factors help or define or measure a culture. So if you can remember, there's internal factors, there's external factors, where the organisation fits in the wider world. the management, how things are communicated and decision making. The list is endless. And I just want to, and obviously then slide section 6, we just went through how to change an organization culture, which I think the crux is it's not easy. It's hard. It costs money. You can have lots of grey hairs and arguments and tears, but the key thing is if you can get the culture working well, it's brilliant. So on that. So I just want to run through 2 quick case studies, and I think I've touched on one of them already. The first one is a large multinational organization that was a market leader, which was very bureaucratic, slow in decision making. I had a large workforce spread across locations. Each individual location would have its own unique culture. So if you can imagine, lots of small cultures. The organization itself, it was based in North America. They wanted to change the culture to be more agile, quick and reactive, which is not uncommon. Every firm wants to do that. So what they actually had is a dedicated, very prescriptive way of new ways of working across the organization that says you need to work in these manners. For some firms, some parts of these multiple locations I mentioned earlier, it helped. And it was good, especially some of the areas that have been sort of doing this in certain nationalities. But the issue was not all teams needed to change, but they were forced to adopt these new ways of working, which obviously they didn't like, and actually made things worse. So it was perceived as compulsory, and anything that you were doing now wasn't fit for purpose. It caused a large amount of skepticism. Online tools, Kanban boards, well, good. For those people who don't really understand it or not been brought up with them, sort of see them as some sort of like fad. And a lot of the management didn't actually follow the new ways of working. So basically, it was a sort of like a mismatch there, which actually created a drag on speed. So I think with hindsight, one change does not fit all cultures. Even though it's one firm, this was one firm with lots of small cultures across locations. The changes should not have been made compulsory across the organisation because it was just a good idea at the time, even then. Basically, what the firm should have looked at of all the individual teams and areas, locations that needed them, and then make them use it. If a firm's quite agile and quicker and reactive, why change it? They're already doing it. They may not do it the way exactly how you want to do it, but they can still do it. But for the other teams, they should have been made more optional. So I think the key lesson here is that a direct cultural change from the top, why a good idea has to be implemented in a local manner. Another one, which is similar-ish, a large firm acquired a smaller firm via a corporate takeover. The large firm was a big global player with many products, extremely profitable, because I remember I was working there, and supported by a large infrastructure, technology, buildings, processes. The smaller firm was a market leader, but in their own country. They were very, very profitable, but there was some way in their infrastructure and their support and control just generally quick. Basically, the firm had gone from zero to a massive profitable firm in a very short period. And while the customer service and selling was going well, the operational stuff was lacking. So what they actually said, as part of the merger, the smaller, nimble market leader in their country firm would have to use the parent's infrastructure I say immediately, as soon as they could be onboarded. And there was just a massive cultural mismatch that caused, real tension from the start. The smaller firm felt that the larger firm was slow, bureaucratic, and full of jobs worths, i.e. they just followed the process regardless. And they actually resisted the change immediately to the point that they actually started setting up their own central data center and legal team, so they didn't have to use their parents' firm. And also, a number of the key staff in the smaller firm got very, very fed up, and this left the firm quickly and very publicly. There was actually articles in the press about this. But the larger firm felt the smaller firm were arrogant freewheelers. So you can see it's a big cultural mismatch here. And this actually mismatch caused permanent damage, and it should have been managed much more tactfully. Basically, with hindsight, should have imposing cultural change on it, which has actually caused an issue because there was a cultural mismatch. They should have worked together. They should have spoke together before everything was forced on them, i.e. to understand and empathise people's points of view, build a migration plan to gradually integrate, not try and do it all over like a 3-month period. And senior management needed to be more supportive as well as sympathetic as well. So it was all really much, this is a case of saying, look, well, we agree everything should be centralized, but understand the cultural changes of that. Okay, so that sort of brings us to the end. I think we're almost about, looking at my watch, about 3 minutes to go. So just looking at the wrap up. As I said before, a culture is the personality of an organization, and it's formed over many years through behaviors and experiences, good and bad. It determines how things are done in the organization, how decision making is done or not, how money is spent or not, how communication is done or not. And these factors then drive performance. Key thing is, and the second case study hopefully highlights that importantly, organizations will have different subcultures. As I mentioned before, that was clear in that second case study. So therefore, consultants or project managers or anybody who need to understand the culture. While I did have some slides on changing the culture, it's a big project. If you're coming in to do a project within an organization, you need to understand that culture so you can manage yourself within the way things are done, for want of a better word. Measuring culture can be hard. It's a multivariate measure, i.e. there's many different variables to measure it, everything from how do you treat your customers, how do you treat your suppliers, all the way down to decision making. Are there how much fear and resistance is in the organization? Again, those slides covered everything. And as mentioned, internal and external, and hard tangible versus soft intangible. But there are various behaviours and practices, spelt wrong, that can be used to manage a culture. And again, on those set of slides in the middle of the presentation, that provided everything hopefully you can use. But as I said, but it is possible to change a culture. But as I mentioned earlier, it needs determination and in particular persistence and a lot of work. So thanks for listening. There are my details down there if you want to stay in contact. So my email, my personal website, my LinkedIn site. For those who know, I've written quite a few books across mainly change management and technology. So therefore, I hope you found this useful. If anybody's got any questions, please let me know. Although I do need to dash in about, I think the session's due to end on the hour. So thank you very much.